This is the Ross Kaminsky Show. Now, Ross Kaminsky on Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
When one of the most successful mass tort lawyers in the country tells me that he is looking at what is possibly the most complicated litigation he's ever seen, I want to hear more. I don't know whether Mike Burg wants me to call him famous, but within his world, Mike Burg certainly is. Co-founding shareholder of Burg Simpson, one of the most successful mass tort attorneys anywhere. His firm has won over $1 billion in verdicts and judgments and settlements. I also, before we get into the conversation, very much want to recommend Mike's book, Trial by Fire, which I read when it came out. It's probably close to 3 years ago now. But anyway, I very much recommend Trial by Fire. Mike Burg, good morning. Welcome back to the K-House Studios. Great to have you back.
Thanks for having me, Ross.
One quick kind of foundational question before we start talking about opioids. What's the difference between mass tort and class action?
It's a large difference. I actually could teach a whole course on it, but I'll do the quick version. One, class action, you have one or two people that represent the entire group. And they're all in together. In mass tort, you have to represent every individual client separately, even though they are then put together for litigation, for pretrial discovery. Also, some trials to try to figure out what the values are in federal court. But as a lawyer and as a client, you are being represented individually. In a class action, you have class representatives who represent everybody. That's the main difference.
So when you are involved in a mass tort case, do you represent multiple clients on the same side?
Yes.
You do, but but you treat them each as individual clients, even though they're all kind of going after the same thing.
Right, and you have to be very careful ethically. You need to make sure when a settlement occurs, everyone is being totally informed, and you have to have a judge or a special master approve the settlement. There's a lot of hoops you got to jump through to make sure there's no ethical violation when you're doing a mass tort case.
Okay, so let's jump into... Let me just start with the Denver Post headline from a few days ago. More than 1 billion prescription opioid pills streamed into Colorado amid national crisis. They talk about a database that tracks this stuff. Over a 7-year period, 1 billion, 22 million, blah, 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 of these pills came in just to Colorado. Talk a little bit about the scale of the situation and then the lawsuit or lawsuits that are arising from the situation.
The scale is beyond anything we've ever seen. In tobacco, which was one of the largest mass tort cases, which included both the federal court case as well as state court cases, that was one of the largest. One of the others I was involved in was actually Vioxx, was one of the largest mass tort cases. This one is 10 times the size of a Vioxx. Vioxx, we had 80,000 people that were plaintiffs. Here, you probably have, and again, they don't have an exact number, but we're talking about millions of addicts that have been put on opioids. And the complexity of it is incredible because the size of it is, it's really 3 generations. And let me try to explain that. We have people that were put on opioids who are in their 60s. And then they have this next generation that were put on opioids. And in many cases, when a baby is born, they're already addicted because through the fetus, you're getting that addiction. And so we have another generation of people who are young, babies, kids, who have that whole next generation of addiction. So the problem itself, in order to have it work or to try to fix the problem, it's going to go on for years and years and years and years, and it's going to take hundreds of billions of dollars to try to fix it, maybe even $1 trillion to try to fix it.
Wow.
And the problem is, while these companies are huge, they're never going to survive hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in payment. So that's one of the first problems with the litigation.
When you get to the phase of a case where you're arguing about damages amounts, how much does that conversation directly tie into your or somebody's estimate of what it will cost to quote unquote fix the problem?
It should be related, but in this particular case, it's probably not, and I can explain that.
Go ahead.
Well, one of the problems you have is that unlike tobacco, we had a number of defendants. And we all knew that the plaintiffs were the ones who were going to, and the states, were going to get the money. Here, it's even more complicated because the lawsuits that have been filed, both in state court and federal court, have been filed on behalf of, let's start at the top, or let's start at the bottom, is probably easier, municipalities, for the services they've been providing to people who are addicted and the money they've spent. Mm-hmm. The counties. So you've got municipalities, cities, counties, states, and for the first time I've ever seen, the federal government is in this case. They have entered their appearance. Their position is, if you, the state, got Medicaid money from the federal government, it's our money, and we should be compensated back. The states, and we have one ruling from one state court that have agreed with this position, which is the states are saying, municipalities, counties, you don't have the standing to bring this case. It's our money. And in fact, one judge has said municipalities, counties don't have standing, meaning the right to bring the case.
Wow.
Because so the complexity before you even get started, which is the question you asked, which is, where's that money going to go, is still undetermined. I mean, this is a 10 to 15-year case. Now, I will say this, and I'm kind of jumping ahead, there will be a giant settlement. There already was a big settlement, a fairly big settlement in Oklahoma. Unfortunately, the money went to Texas A&M to build, that was with one defendant, mm-hmm. with Purdue. They gave it to Texas A&M to build some sort of a research center. Well, that doesn't help the people who were addicted. That money in tobacco, a lot of it also happened. The people didn't get the money. In individual cases they did, but in a lot of the settlements with the states, that money never went to them. It went into the state coffers. The judges made them put those commercials on. That this right. is, and there were some other things that happened, but
you think that'll be the same? Do you, in the sense of people who are addicted and can prove? Let's say somebody could prove to a jury that they became addicted because of overprescription and somebody doing something wrong. Will that person see $1?
He might. I can't tell you because we're not far enough along yet. But here's the other problem. I've just showed you the problem about who gets the money, but let's talk about who the defendants are.
Yes.
Here's the other problem, and this is one of the reasons why we are in it in a very small way, and I'll explain that later. But we had a chance to be in it in a big way, and because of all these things, it became. We felt that it was better for our firm not to be involved in a big way. But let me explain who the defendants are.
And just pause for 1 second. For those listeners who may be just joining us, I'm talking to Mike Burg, very well-known, highly successful mass tort attorney right here in Denver with Burg Simpson Law Firm. And what we're talking about is this increasing number of lawsuits that probably will mostly be consolidated about the opioid epidemic. All right, so continue, please.
So the defendants are the manufacturers, which are, all the big drug companies. And that one of their defenses are it did what it was supposed to do. It's a painkiller. And yes, you get it when you get hurt. Yes, when you have surgery. Yes, you're supposed to get it certain periods of time. And it's unlike a Vioxx or many of the other drugs that we've handled, the birth control pills, the Yaz, where they didn't do what they're supposed to do.
Right.
Here, it does what it's supposed to do. And that's one of their defenses. They're going to say, look, now they monitor how much they're selling. They're making billions and billions and billions of dollars off the sale of it. So that's the first level. Then you have the distributor, like McKesson. They had an order that they were supposed to track where the drugs were going. They're the distributor, and they violated that order. Okay, and they're going to say, yeah, we violated it, but we didn't sell the drug. It's going to be their defense. We didn't sell it. We're sorry, we didn't track it as well as we should, but we shouldn't be held fully responsible. Then you have the doctors, the pill pushers, the overprescribers, the doctors. You're talking of thousands and thousands of doctors that have been prescribing these opioids. And in some cases, they're pill mills. In some cases, it's a scam. And so you have those as defendants. And then lastly, don't forget the addicted person. That person saying, we told you this was addictive. And you kept writing your own scripts. You went from doctor to doctor. And also, by the way, now you couldn't get the pills anymore because we stopped it. Now you're on meth. Now you're on heroin. It's cheaper. Meth is really the transition that people on opioids go to if they can't get the pills. So how much responsibility do they have? So you can see when you're talking about how you're going to figure out who should pay for what, at what levels, it becomes a very complicated situation, both on who gets the money and who's responsible.
I find the legal questions fascinating. And a lot of the stuff a lot of these big issues really seem to be with these middlemen. You mentioned McKesson, Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals as well. They see some of these just enormous orders. One of them was talked about in the Washington Post with some pharmacy that ordered 2,520 bottles of oxycodone, and at least, and I get that there may be some bias in the reporting itself, but they sure make it sound like some of these firms just did everything they could to short circuit their own control processes because they had dollar signs in their eyes.
Absolutely. All of them, all the way down the line. And I didn't mention the pharmacies, but they're also in that chain, and I'm glad you brought it up. They're also there. They're supposed to have checks and balances. They're supposed to have computers that if you get drugs that are being given to you that are have a bad interaction, they're supposed to tell you shouldn't take that drug with this drug. So they've all abandoned their responsibility for the dollar sign.
So we've got about 4 minutes left here. You're talking about, and I can easily imagine, this being the mother of all settlements, like a bigger settlement than like something that would make tobacco look small. I can imagine that.
Yes.
Is there enough money I realize some of the companies that are defendants are quite large, and I realize that many of them have some insurance behind them, although the insurance companies will argue that they're not going to pay for malfeasance. Is there enough money, or is the result of this mostly going to be several companies go bankrupt and nobody gets, a couple more than a few % of what you think the settlement should be?
There will be a large, multi-billion-dollar settlement. Who's going to make that? Who's going to get that money? The lawyers that are in leadership who are working, and I know them. We could have been part of them. We elected not to be. They're working day and night, 24/7. They're going to get their share. After that, the state is going to get their share. I don't know whether the government is going to be able, the federal government is going to be able to take that from the states. I project, and a lot of people are going to hate me for saying this, I don't think the municipalities and the counties are going to get anything, or if they do, it'll be a small amount. But I'm very concerned no matter how many billions are paid. Number one, it won't be enough.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, is it ever going to really go and help the end user, the person who's addicted?
So my question is not as much who's going to get the money as it is the money there? Like, I imagine, okay, a $50 billion settlement or what, let's just pick a number like that for a second, which is not what this is going to be. I'm saying if there were a number like $50 billion, I can imagine that could somehow be cobbled together and done over some number of years. But if you start talking about a settlement that has another zero on it, would that money ever actually get paid, or will that just be a settlement in theory because the companies that end up on the hook for it just file and we're done?
It's possible that could happen. It happened in breast implants, which is much smaller, where companies went under. But I will say this, the people trying to get the money understand the limits, and they don't want to bankrupt the company because that does nobody any good. This is going to be, I think, the largest settlement of any case in the history of the United States, but it'll be a fraction of the money that's needed to really make a dent and do something about the problem.
Very hard for me to imagine that Purdue survives as a company.
Right.
The rest, maybe they will.
Well, they all made billions. McKesson made billions. They've all made billions and billions of dollars.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'll tell you what, folks. There's just so much to see here. And as Mike said, this is going to be going on for not just years. I mean, potentially 2 decades, at least one.
For sure. Most MDLs that we've been involved go on for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years.
Yeah.
This one is going to go on way beyond that.
Way beyond. And so many, not just so many defendants and not just so many plaintiffs, but so many different kinds of defendants and different kinds of plaintiffs. It's going to be a food fight. I have to say I'm impressed that you avoided the temptation to get into the leadership of this. I'll tell you what, when we come back with Mike Burg, we're going to switch gears. Mike knows John Hickenlooper pretty well, paid close attention to the debate last night, and has some really interesting thoughts about politics from a perspective that I don't think you hear often enough. So we're going to do a little of that right after this.
This report is sponsored by Lowe's.
I'm Martino, this morning at 10 on Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
All right, even though I can't afford his hourly rate, Mike Burg has agreed to stick around for a little while longer. Mike Burg, founding shareholder in the Burg Simpson law firm, one of the most successful mass tort attorneys anywhere. His firm has won over $1 billion in verdicts and judgments and settlements. I want to recommend that you read Mike's book, Trial by Fire. It's a really good book. We spent some time talking about the opioid epidemic, but when Mike first came in, we were talking politics a little bit. So I asked him if he could stick around. Mike is pretty close with John Hickenlooper.
Correct.
And I wanted to get your take on what you thought about his performance in last night's debate, maybe in comparison to the first debate, and then we'll move on to whether you think it's enough.
I would say I think he did a lot better. I actually texted with him. The first debate, I think he was overwhelmed with all the. First of all, he's a gentleman. He has great ideas. He's done some wonderful things here in the state, and I think he'd be a great president. But he was having trouble with people yelling and cutting people off and not having any courtesy with each other. And he and I talked about it, and I said, John, you're going to have to, try to break out of that. And he said, it's really hard for him personally when you got all these people who will do and say and yell and cut you off. They did better last night. I thought he did really well last night. I thought his when he talked to Bernie about that where they're going could cost the election.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought he really made a lot of good points in that regard. He's a little bit over 2% right now. He doesn't have the funding that he needs yet to get in the next debate, and he needs more individual small donors.
I assume you're a Democrat, but I don't actually know. I shouldn't make assumptions.
Well, I've been both. I will tell you I was a Democrat, and then when I became partners with Al and Simpson, I became a Republican. Al and I talked about that. Al's a moderate Republican.
Yeah.
And then obviously when the far right, the Breitbart wing of the party kind of took over, then I went back to being a Democrat.
Okay. One of the things that strikes me about Hickenlooper, and I remember seeing an article somewhere today talking about last night's debate, said, nobody seems like a happy warrior. To me, of all the people, if any one of the 20 Dems who are on stage over the two nights comes close to being a happy warrior, it's probably John Hickenlooper. More the happy side than the warrior side. So my question for you, as a, I think, fairly objective observer, even though you're a Hickenlooper supporter, objective observer of the whole thing, do you think the Democratic Party is in a mood right now to have a happy warrior, or do they really want someone who's just going to go punch Donald Trump in the mouth like Harris showed she might be? Elizabeth Warren seems very aggressive. Bernie Sanders, angry and aggressive. Do they want someone kind of upbeat and modest like Hickenlooper? I
think, I hate to quote Steve Bannon, but because he's not one of my favorite people, but he was, I don't know if you ever saw the interview with him. I can't remember if it was on 60 Minutes. He said, look, the country's very, very, very divided, but so are the parties.
Mm-hmm.
The Republican Party has now gone to the Trump Party, not the George Will Conservative Party. And he predicted that the Democrats are going to have the same problem. And they are. Donald Trump wants to make the squad, or Warren or Bernie, the face of the Democratic Party. Right now, that's what's getting all the attention.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if the Democratic Party is ready for a John Hickenlooper who has accomplished so much on gun control with regard to, basically the environment, taking Colorado economically from somewhere around 30 to the top 1 or 2 in the country. But I think the people are ready for a happy warrior. I think the independents are ready for we want the chaos to go away.
Mm-hmm.
I think generally the public wants the chaos to go away. Whether the party wants that, I'm hoping that what happened last night will push John higher in the polls. He's up over 2%. And he finally was on, the national stage throwing his hands up, which I thought was a great move, with Bernie saying, this is not going to work. You can't do this. You can't take away 150 million people's insurance. We can do it. We can have everybody insured at some level, as well as what you were talking about earlier. We talked about $1,000 per person every month.
Yeah.
I mean, these are ideas that just can't work practically. John's a very practical guy.
So John Hickenlooper's your friend, so I want to exclude him here for a second. If John Hickenlooper were not in the race, who would be your favorite Democrat right now and why?
It's a hard thing to say because he is the one candidate, I think, that has a track record. On the other hand, I'd be torn between a Biden, who unfortunately he's going to have to do a lot better tonight because he looked very old in his responses. He certainly has the track record. He'd be someone. I know Kamala Harris. I've had cases in California when she was the Attorney General. She's very bright. And so she'd be another person that I would consider, even though their politics are somewhat different. But I'm afraid that if we go to the far left progressive, I really think there's going to be, unfortunately, people will stay home.
So I really haven't talked politics with you before, but so I don't know whether your view of Donald Trump is modest dislike, serious disdain, or outright hatred. I imagine I imagine you're not a fan.
I'm not a fan for a lot of reasons. One, I'm concerned about the debt, which is which should be a Republican issue. As my partner Alan Simpson has been going around the country on the Simpson Bowls when they did that, how are we going to fix the debt?
Right.
He is just spending money. I hate to use the expression like a drunken sailor, because I'm not sure there's any drunken sailors out there. But so that's one thing I don't like about him. I also think that his style, his attack style, his confrontative style is bad for the country. We need to bring people together. And lastly, the thing I really don't like, the biggest problem I have with him is that he has made friends with the dictators in the world and has turned on, whether it's Canada fighting with them, Mexico, the NATO countries. That's scary to me.
So I agree with you, and we've only got about a minute here. I agree with you on 1 and 3 in particular. Number 2 was sort of a Coke versus Pepsi kind of thing, like what's your taste? I don't love his style either, but that number 2, the style thing, his supporters love that. Right. For them, that's a huge plus, even his supporters who don't like the big spending. So my closing question for you then is there any Democrat among the current field who you think is so unacceptable that if that person was the nominee, you would at least strongly consider voting for Donald Trump?
No. That's I just couldn't do it. We need to have a society in which people have some dignity, and you can have a discussion without attacking people.
If Bernie Sanders were the Democratic nominee, would you vote for him, or would you vote third party, or not vote?
I'm not sure at this point in time what I would do. If it happens, I'll make that decision then. But I knew I wouldn't vote for Donald Trump just because I have grandchildren. I want them to live in a society where people can have a disagreement and figure it out together.
Yeah, I get that point, and I've got kids, and my fear is that although I find Donald Trump to have an egregious personality, I find him mostly pretty good on policy, except for some of the trade stuff, and I'm scared to death of what Democrats will do to the country economically and my children's futures. Got to leave it there. Mike Burg, founder of the well-known Burg Simpson law firm, partner with Alan Simpson. How fantastic is that? I mean, oh my gosh.
Unbelievable.
I'd love to sit down and have a beer with that guy and you someday.
I've done it. Well, maybe we can do it
Maybe
one day,
we can
Ross.
do it. Everybody check out Trial by Fire, Mike Burg's book about his life as a mass tort lawyer and his life before that kind of led him to the success that he's had. It's a really, really good book. Mike, thanks for being here. Next time we'll talk about body parts.
Thank you very much, Ross.
All right, we'll be right back on the